she didn't cry. That somehow made it worse. Elizabeth Sterling set the brooch on the counter without a tremor in her hand, though everything inside her was breaking. Vincent stood near the back of the shop, half swallowed by shadow, a duke who had crossed an ocean only to find the woman he'd never stopped loving trading away the last proof of who she used to be.
Outside, London wept in a cold October drizzle, the kind that soaked through wool and settled into bone. Inside, the pawnshop smelled of dust, brass polish, and quiet ruin, the particular scent of people arriving with treasures and leaving with nothing.
He had only meant to pass through this street. A carriage delay, nothing more. He was not supposed to be here at all. And yet here he was, still as stone, watching her. The pawnbroker lifted a jeweller's loop to his eye, turning the brooch beneath the gaslight. "Sentimental value doesn't pay rent, miss," he muttered, not unkindly, just tired. "This is worth perhaps £8. "No more." Elizabeth's chin lifted a fraction. "Then £8 it is." Vincent's jaw tightened. He knew that brooch. He'd seen it pinned to her collar years ago, in a warmer house, in a life that no longer existed for either of them.
He did not step forward. Not yet.
Because some part of him needed to know, needed to feel, in his chest, exactly how far she had fallen before he decided exactly how far he was willing to go to bring her back. The old man reached for his ledger, pen scratching against paper, and somewhere behind that small, ordinary sound, a decision was already forming in the Duke of Westfield's mind, one that would cost him his pride and give her back everything she'd lost, whether she asked for it or not. The bell above the pawnshop door had barely stopped ringing when Vincent made his decision. He waited until Elizabeth's footsteps faded into the wet street outside, until the door swung shut and the cold air settled again, before he stepped out of the shadows. Hemlock startled, the ledger nearly slipping from his hands. "Your Grace, she didn't realise." "You will forget I was here," Vincent said quietly. "And you will sell me that brooch. Now. Before she's gone the length of the street." The old man's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to the coin Vincent was already placing on the counter, far more than £8, far more than the piece was worth to anyone but the man buying it back. "There's a discretion fee, Your Grace, for buying back a pledge so quickly. Some might call it suspicious. Then let them call it what they like." Vincent's voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "I want her address as well. Whatever you have in your records." Hemlock hesitated, only a moment before the second coin landed beside the first.
Some silences said more than pleading ever could.
The address was written in Hemlock's cramped hand on a torn scrap of paper, a street Vincent had never had reason to walk, in a part of London where dukes did not go, where lamps burned low and doors stayed bolted after dark. He read it twice, then folded it into his coat pocket like something fragile. Outside, the rain had turned to a fine, cutting mist, and Elizabeth Sterling was already 3 streets ahead of him, walking fast, head down, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. He did not follow her that night. He told himself it was because a gentleman did not trail a lady through the dark like a common thief. The truth was crueler. He was afraid of what he'd see if he got too close too soon. So he went home to his townhouse instead, poured a brandy he didn't drink, and stared at that scrap of paper until the candle burned low, turning her name over in his mind like a wound he couldn't stop touching. By morning he had made his decision, and it was not one he intended to unmake. He dressed simply, deliberately, no crest, no crown of authority stitched into his collar, nothing that would announce the Duke of Westfield to anyone watching from a doorway. Just a plain grey coat and the collar turned up, the same disguised poverty forced on half of London. The carriage he ordered stopped 2 streets short of the address, and he walked the rest of the way on foot, past children with bare feet on frozen cobblestones, past a woman selling wilted violets for a penny a bunch. The building, when he found it, made his stomach turn. It leaned sideways as if exhausted, its brick face black with soot, its windows patched with paper where the glass had long since broken. A door hung crooked on one hinge. Somewhere inside, a baby was crying, thin and relentless. Vincent stood across the street for a full minute before he could make himself cross it. This was where she lived now. This was what her pride had cost her all, perhaps what other people's cruelty had cost her, and she was simply the one paying the bill. He climbed the stairs slowly, the wood groaning beneath his boots, and counted doors until he reached the one Hemlock's note had described third floor, end of the hall, the one with frost creeping along the frame from the inside. He raised his hand to knock and then stopped, listening. There were voices behind the door. Elizabeth's voice, and a man's rough, impatient, the voice of someone who had done this 100 times before and felt nothing about doing it again. "Final notice, Miss Sterling. Mr. Greatley doesn't extend charity to those who can't pay, and neither do I. I paid last week." Elizabeth's voice, though tired, held steel in it. "Every shilling I had."
Last week isn't this week.
Vincent's hand tightened into a fist at his side. He pushed the door open without knocking. The room beyond was smaller than his own dressing room, the single window cracked and stuffed with rags against the draught, the fireplace cold and empty of coal. Elizabeth stood near a table with one wobbling leg, facing down a broad-shouldered man in a shabby brown coat who held a ledger like a weapon. Both of them turned at the sound of the door. "Who the devil are you?" the debt collector demanded. Vincent said nothing at first. He simply looked at Elizabeth really, looked at the threadbare shawl around her shoulders, at the hollow shadows beneath her eyes, at the way her hands, though clenched, still trembled faintly with cold or exhaustion or both. She looked back at him, and something in her face cracked open for just a moment's shock, disbelief, and beneath it, something rower that she immediately fought to bury.
Vincent!
The collector glanced between them, sensing a shift in the room he didn't understand. "You know this gentleman, miss?" "I know him," Elizabeth said carefully, "from another life." Vincent finally spoke, and his voice had gone glacial, not the voice of a man who had stumbled in by accident, but one who had walked in with a purpose he intended to see through. "How much does she owe?" The collector blinked. £3, 6 shillings, sir, and rising by the... Vincent was already reaching into his coat. "Vincent, don't," Elizabeth snapped, stepping forward. "I don't need." "You need warmth," he said, not unkindly, but without room for argument. "You need food. You need a door that locks properly and a window that isn't stuffed with rags to keep out the winter." He turned to the collector and placed far more than £3.6 into the man's stunned hands. "Tell Mr. Greatley the debt is settled. Tell him also that if he sends anyone to this address again, for any reason, he will find himself explaining his business practices to the Duke of Westfield's solicitors." The colour drained from the collector's face. He fumbled the coins, muttered something that might have been an apology, and fled the room so quickly he nearly tripped over the doorframe. Silence fell, thick and awkward, broken only by the crying baby somewhere below. Elizabeth crossed her arms, chin lifted in that same defiant angle he'd seen in the pawn shop. "You had no right." "I had every right," he said softly. "I've had it for years and never once used it. Forgive me for finally spending it on something that mattered." Her eyes glistened, but she blinked the shine away before it could fall. "I don't need rescuing, Vincent. I need you to leave. I saw you at the pawn shop yesterday," he said, ignoring the demand entirely. "I bought back your brooch." Something in her posture faltered just slightly, just enough for him to see the crack beneath the armour. "You had no business following me." "I had no intention of it," he admitted. "Fate simply arranged an inconvenient truth in front of me, and I couldn't unsee it." She turned away from him, walking to the window, staring out through the gap in the rags at the grey sliver of sky beyond. 3 years, Vincent. 3 years, and not a single letter. And now you appear in my doorway like some guilty conscience made flesh, throwing money at debt collectors as if that erases anything. "It doesn't erase anything," he agreed quietly. "Nothing could. But I am not here to erase the past, Elizabeth. I am here because I cannot walk away from this room and pretend I never saw it." She said nothing for a long moment, her shoulders rigid, her breath visible in the cold air of the unheated garret. "Why did you really come?" she finally asked, still facing the window. And Vincent, staring at the back of the woman he had loved in silence for years, understood that the answer to that question was going to change both their lives, whether she was ready for it or not. He didn't answer her that day. Some truths he'd learned needed the right room to be spoken in, not a freezing garret with a broken table and a debt collector's threat still hanging in the air. Instead, he left, but not before instructing the landlord downstairs, in a voice that brooked no argument, that the widow on the 3rd floor was to have coal delivered daily, and that the bill was to be sent to his townhouse, not hers. The landlord's eyes had widened at the name Vincent finally allowed himself to give, and Vincent knew word would spread through that building by nightfall. He didn't care. Let it spread. Elizabeth's dignity mattered more to him than his own discretion. That evening, alone in his study, he sat with pen and paper for hours, drafting and discarding a dozen different letters, each one either too cold or too revealing, too formal or too raw.
In the end, he wrote nothing at all. Some conversations could not happen on paper.
The following afternoon, he returned to her door not sneaking, not hesitating, but walking the front stairs of that crumbling building as though it were the marble steps of his own estate. Elizabeth opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd heard his footsteps and had been waiting, bracing herself. "You again," she said, though there was less venom in it now than exhaustion. "Me again," Vincent agreed. "May I come in?" "I promise not to throw money at anyone this time." A ghost of a smile flickered at the corner of her mouth before she caught it and smoothed it away. She stepped aside to let him in. The room was warmer than the day before, coal burning low in the grate, courtesy of his instructions, but the poverty of it remained undisguised. A single chair, a narrow cot, a trunk that likely held everything she owned in the world. "I've thought of nothing else since yesterday," Vincent said, standing near the small fire, his hands clasped behind his back like a man steadying himself before a difficult negotiation. "And I have a proposal for you. A business one." Elizabeth's brow furrowed. "Business." "I require a head administrator for Westfield Estate," he said, each word measured, deliberate, rehearsed a dozen times in his mind the night before. "My current steward is incompetent, my accounts are in disarray, and my household staff has not been properly managed in years. I need someone with intelligence, discipline, and an eye for detail that borders on ruthless. You're offering me a position as your steward?" Her voice held disbelief, but also faintly the flicker of something like hope, quickly suppressed.
"I'm offering you a marriage," Vincent said.
The words landed in the small room like a dropped glass, sharp and sudden.
Elizabeth stared at him. A marriage?
"A marriage of convenience," he clarified quickly, before she could read anything into it that he wasn't yet prepared to let her see. "Strictly contractual. You would become the Duchess of Westfield in name and on duty, running the estate, managing its accounts, its staff, its affairs. In return, you would want for nothing. No debt collectors. No freezing garrets. No pawning family heirlooms for rent money. And what would you want in return? Elizabeth asked, her voice careful, guarded, as though she expected a trap beneath the offer. Order, Vincent said simply. Compétence. A wife on paper who needs not pretend affection she doesn't feel, and who I will never ask to pretend it. This is not a love match, Elizabeth. It is a rescue dressed in a legal contract, and I am asking you to accept it because I cannot think of another way to help you that your pride would allow. There it was, the truth, or as much of it as he dared give her, wrapped carefully enough that she might mistake it for cold practicality rather than the desperate, aching love he'd carried silently since the day she'd left his family's employ. Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something mockery perhaps, or pity, and finding neither. You would marry me, she said slowly, as an act of practicality. I would marry you, Vincent said, because it solves both our problems. I need a Duchess capable of managing an estate that is currently bleeding money through the incompetence of thieving stewards. You need a life that does not end with you starving in a garret, or worse. He watched something shift behind her eyes, not romance, not yet, but calculation, the kind a woman backed into a corner uses to survive. I need time to think, she said finally. Take the night, Vincent replied, and turned to leave before his composure could crack and reveal how much rode on her answer. At the door, he paused.
Elizabeth.
She looked up. Whatever you decide, he said quietly, I will still see that coal is delivered. That much, at least, was never conditional. He left her standing in the small warming room, staring after him with an expression he couldn't read, and he walked back into the cold London evening, carrying the full weight of a lie he had constructed with such precision that he almost believed it himself. Almost. 3 days passed before Elizabeth sent word. 3 days in which Vincent paced his study at odd hours, rewrote the marriage contract twice to make its terms more generous without making them suspicious, and told himself unconvincingly that her answer would not matter to him either way. When the note finally arrived, it was short, written in her precise, elegant hand. I accept your terms, Your Grace. Practically speaking, I have little choice, and you know it. I ask only that the contract be exactly what you say it is, nothing more, nothing less. E.S. Vincent read it 4 times before folding it and placing it in the drawer where he kept the few things in his life that mattered. He did not smile exactly, but something in his chest, tight and starved for years, loosened just slightly. The contract was signed in his solicitor's office on a grey Tuesday morning, Elizabeth's hand steady as she wrote her name beside his, her expression carefully composed into the same iron mask she'd worn in the pawnshop days before. You understand the terms, the solicitor said, more to Vincent than to her, as though needing to confirm the arrangement's oddity aloud. A marriage of practical convenience. Separate quarters. The Duchess to assume full administrative authority over the estate's household and accounts. I understand them perfectly, Elizabeth said, before Vincent could answer. The solicitor glanced between them, clearly sensing something unspoken crackling beneath the businesslike surface of the room, but he said nothing further. Men in his profession learned not to ask questions that weren't paid for. The ceremony itself was small, quiet, and utterly without the trappings Vincent's title might have demanded. No grand cathedral, no crowd of society's finest pretending joy they didn't feel. Just a private chapel, a sombre vicar, and 2 witnesses paid well enough to keep their silence about the whole strange affair. Elizabeth wore a simple grey dress, not a wedding gown, and Vincent found himself unable to look away from her throughout the brief ceremony, not because of the dress, but because of the fierce, guarded dignity with which she held herself, as though daring the universe to pity her one more time. When the vicar pronounced them married, Vincent turned to her and for the first time since the pawn shop, allowed himself to say something true. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me enough to accept." "I don't trust you," Elizabeth said, not unkindly, just honestly. "I trust the contract. There's a difference." It was, Vincent thought, exactly the answer he deserved, and exactly the kind of answer that made him more determined than ever to prove her wrong, slowly, patiently, without ever revealing the lie stitched into the arrangement's foundation. The carriage ride to Westfield Estate took the better part of a day, rolling through countryside that grew wilder and more windswept the further they travelled from London's soot-stained streets. Elizabeth said little during the journey, watching the landscape change through the carriage window, rolling hills, giving way to dense woodland, and finally, as dusk began to settle, the first distant silhouette of Westfield Estate rising against the darkening sky like something out of a Gothic novel. "It's larger than I remembered," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "You've seen it before?" "Once. Years ago. Before everything." She didn't elaborate, and Vincent didn't press, understanding that some doors were not yet ready to be opened. The estate, when the carriage finally rolled to a stop before its imposing entrance, was even grander and more neglected than Vincent had described. Ivy crawled unchecked along one wing of the stone facade. Several windows on the upper floors sat dark and shuttered. The grounds, once meticulously kept according to old records, had grown wild and overgrown in patches, as though the entire estate had simply given up trying. Elizabeth stepped down from the carriage and stood for a moment, taking it all in with the sharp, assessing gaze Vincent remembered from her days as a governess, the same gaze she'd once used to evaluate a classroom of unruly children, now turned on an entire crumbling estate. "This is a disaster," she said flatly.
"Yes," Vincent admitted. "It is."
Your steward.
"Mr. Aldrich Bramwell. He's managed the estate's accounts for the past decade. I have reason to believe he's managed them primarily into his own pockets." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, sharpening into something dangerous and focused. "Then I suppose I have my first task as Duchess." She marched up the front steps without waiting for him, and Vincent found himself hurrying to keep pace, a strange and unfamiliar warmth blooming in his chest at the sight of her taking immediate command of a house that had, until that moment, been slowly rotting from neglect and theft. The household staff assembled in the entrance hall to greet their new Duchess with the stiff, formal reception reserved for outsiders, polite bows, murmured welcomes, and beneath it all, a current of unmistakable resentment that Elizabeth clearly noticed and chose, for the moment, to ignore. Mr. Bramwell, a portly man with a florid face and small, calculating eyes, stepped forward with an oily smile. "Your Grace. Welcome to Westfield. I trust your journey was pleasant." "Pleasant enough," Elizabeth said, her tone giving nothing away. "I'll want the estate's full accounts to be brought to my study first thing tomorrow morning. Every ledger, every receipt, every outstanding debt and payment for the past 3 years. Bramwell's smile faltered, just slightly, just enough for Vincent to catch it. "Of course, Your Grace. Though I should mention the accounts are rather complex. It may take some time to compile everything in a manner easily understood." "I have a great deal of patience for complexity, Mr. Bramwell," Elizabeth replied, her smile thin and sharp as a blade. "What I have very little patience for is delay." A ripple of tension passed through the assembled staff, quick and silent, like a current beneath still water. Vincent said nothing, watching his new wife dismantle a decade of comfortable corruption in under 2 minutes, and found himself fighting to keep his expression as neutral as hers. That night, alone in his chambers separate from hers, As the contract stipulated, Vincent stood at his window overlooking the dark, sprawling grounds of Westfield Estate and allowed himself, finally, a small private smile. She was already fighting for a house that wasn't truly hers, with the same fierce, uncompromising spirit she'd once fought for a classroom of children who weren't hers either.
He had married her to save her from ruin.
He hadn't expected that within her first hour at Westfield, she would already be threatening to bring the entire rotten structure of his estate's corruption crashing down around the man. He found, to his own quiet astonishment, that he had never admired her more. Morning came grey and cold, mist curling low across the estate's overgrown gardens, and Elizabeth was already seated at the study desk before the household staff had finished their breakfast preparations. Bramwell arrived precisely on time, a thick stack of ledgers under his arm. His oily smile firmly back in place, as though the previous evening's tension had never occurred. "Your Grace," he said, setting the ledgers down with a heavy thud. As requested. Elizabeth opened the first ledger without preamble, her eyes scanning columns of figures with the quick, practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years managing household budgets on a governess's meagre salary, learning, out of necessity, exactly how numbers could be made to lie. Within minutes, her expression had shifted from neutral assessment to something colder, sharper. "These figures don't reconcile," she said, tapping a column with one finger. The grain purchases from last autumn show an expenditure nearly double what the market rate would suggest, and yet the estate's granary reserves show significantly less stock than such an expenditure should have purchased. Bramwell's smile tightened at the edges. "Prices fluctuate, Your Grace. Poor harvests, difficult negotiations with suppliers."
Show me the supplier invoices.
"I regretfully, some of the older invoices have been misplaced in the transition of." "Find them," Elizabeth said, her voice not raised, not sharp, simply final. "By tomorrow morning." Bramwell's eyes flickered, just for an instant, with something that looked distinctly like panic beneath the practiced calm, and Elizabeth, watching closely, filed that flicker away like a piece of evidence in a case she had already begun quietly building. He left the study with considerably less swagger than he had entered it, and Elizabeth sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "You suspect him," Vincent said from the doorway, where he'd been watching unnoticed for the past several minutes. Elizabeth didn't startle at his sudden presence. "I suspect everyone in this house until I have reason not to. That's how households like this survive corruption, by assuming good faith where none has been earned. A hard philosophy." She closed the ledger with a soft thud. "Your Mr. Bramwell has been stealing from this estate for years, Vincent, and doing it clumsily enough that I'll have proof within the week. The real question is how many others are involved, and how deep the rot goes." Vincent studied her for a long moment, the fierce concentration in her eyes, the way she'd already, within a single morning, transformed from a woman fleeing poverty into a formidable force capable of dismantling an entire structure of institutional theft. "You're remarkable," he said quietly, before he could stop himself. Elizabeth glanced up, something flickering across her face, surprise perhaps, or wariness at unexpected praise from a husband who was supposed to feel nothing more than practical obligation toward her. "I'm thorough," she corrected. "There's a difference." But she held his gaze a moment longer than strictly necessary before returning to her ledgers, and Vincent left the study with his heart beating a fraction faster than it had any right to, given the strictly professional nature of the arrangement they'd both signed their names to. Word of the new Duchess's sharp scrutiny spread through the household staff with remarkable speed, and by the second day, Elizabeth found herself facing resistance from more than just Bramwell alone. The estate's housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who had run the household's day-to-day affairs for years under Bramwell's loose oversight, made her displeasure known through 1,000 small acts of quiet insubordination, delayed responses to Elizabeth's requests, misplaced records, staff who suddenly found themselves too busy to answer the new Duchess's questions. "They don't like being watched," Elizabeth observed to Vincent over a rare shared dinner, the long table between them making the meal feel more like a business meeting than the intimate affair a real marriage might have offered. "Which tells me everything I need to know about what they've been hiding." "You could dismiss them," Vincent suggested. "Bramwell, Pemberton, any of the staff you suspect of complicity." "Not yet." Elizabeth set down her fork with deliberate precision. "If I dismiss them before I have proof, they'll simply take their secrets and, likely whatever they've stolen somewhere else, and the estate will never recover what's owed. I need patience, not haste." "And if they move against you first?" Vincent asked, something protective sharpening in his voice despite his effort to keep it neutral. "These are not gentle people, Elizabeth. Men who steal for years don't relinquish their profits without a fight." "Then let them fight," Elizabeth said, her chin lifting in that same defiant angle he'd come to recognize as the truest expression of who she was beneath all her careful composure. "I've survived worse than corrupt stewards and disapproving housekeepers, Vincent. I survived losing everything once already. I don't intend to lose this estate to the same kind of small, greedy cruelty that cost me my position as a governess." Something in her voice cracked, just slightly, at the mention of her past, a wound clearly still raw despite the years that had passed, and Vincent found himself leaning forward, wanting desperately to ask what had truly happened, what scandal had truly ended her career and left her destitute enough to be pawning heirlooms in a London shop. But before he could ask, Elizabeth had already smoothed her expression back into careful neutrality, closing the door on vulnerability as quickly as she'd opened it. "I should return to the ledgers," she said, rising from the table. "There's still much to review before Bramwell attempts to bury his tracks any further." She left the dining hall with brisk efficiency, and Vincent remained seated in the growing silence, staring at the space where she'd been, understanding with sudden, aching clarity that the woman he'd married on paper carried wounds far deeper than mere poverty wounds, that some corrupt steward's petty theft was only the newest layer atop. Whatever had truly happened to end her career as a governess, whatever scandal had truly stripped her of position and reputation both, Vincent resolved silently that he would uncover it not to use against her, but to understand exactly what battle scars she carried beneath that fierce, unbreakable composure. Because a woman like Elizabeth Sterling did not build walls that high without good reason, and Vincent intended to learn every reason, one patient, careful day at a time. The following days blurred into a steady rhythm of quiet warfare, fought entirely through paperwork and pointed questions, Elizabeth working through the estate's tangled finances with relentless, methodical precision, while the household staff watched her with a mixture of growing respect and simmering resentment. By the end of the first week, she had assembled enough discrepancies in Bramwell's accounts to fill an entire ledger of her own missing invoices, inflated prices, payments to suppliers who, upon discreet inquiry, turned out not to exist at all. "He's been inventing vendors," Elizabeth told Vincent one evening, spreading the evidence across his study desk with the satisfied precision of a hunter finally cornering prey. "Fictitious grain merchants, fictitious repair contractors, all receiving payment for goods and services that were never actually delivered. The money simply vanishes into an account I haven't yet traced." "How much?" Vincent asked, his voice tight with barely contained anger on her behalf, anger that this man had been quietly bleeding his estate dry for years while claiming loyal service. "Conservatively? Several £1,000s over the past 3 years alone." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "And I suspect that figure only scratches the surface." Vincent stood, pacing toward the window, his hands clenched behind his back. Confront him. Tonight. Not yet. Elizabeth's voice remained calm, controlled, though something dangerous simmered beneath it. If I confront him now, with only paper evidence, he'll simply claim clerical error and destroy whatever remains of the original records before we can prove intent. I need him to believe he's still safe long enough to make one more mistake something undeniable.
You're setting a trap.
I'm finishing one he already built for himself, Elizabeth corrected. The moment he decided this family's trust was something to exploit rather than honour. Vincent turned from the window, studying her in the low candlelight, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the unshakable resolve in every line of her posture, and felt something in his chest ache with a longing he had no right to feel toward a wife bound to him only by contract.
I chose well, he said quietly, more to himself than to her.
Elizabeth glanced up, something flickering across her face, confusion perhaps, at the strange warmth in his voice. You chose out of necessity, Vincent. Let's not romanticize a business arrangement. But she held his gaze a beat longer than necessary once again, and in that small, charged silence, Vincent allowed himself to wonder just for a moment whether the wall between practical arrangement and something deeper might, given enough time and patience, eventually begin to crack. Because for a marriage built entirely on a lie of convenience, something uncomfortably real kept sparking in the spaces between them, in stolen glances across dinner tables, in the quiet respect blooming beneath old wounds, in the dangerous growing certainty that this contract, however carefully constructed, might not remain merely contractual for very much longer. And as the household staff continued their quiet campaign of resistance, as Bramwell grew increasingly nervous beneath Elizabeth's watchful scrutiny, and as whispers of the new Duchess's fierce competence began spreading beyond Westfields, walls into the wider circles of London society that had once cast her out, Vincent understood, with the sinking, thrilling certainty of a man watching dominoes begin to fall, that the quiet life he'd promised her in that freezing London garret was about to become anything but quiet. The real battle for Westfield estate and for Elizabeth's fragile, hard-won trust had only just begun. The invitation arrived on cream-coloured paper edged in gold, and Elizabeth turned it over twice before she understood what it truly was: not an invitation at all, but a summons dressed in politeness. The Winter Gala, she read aloud. Hosted by Lady Ashworth. You don't have to attend, Vincent said from across the study, though his tone suggested he already knew she would. I have every intention of attending, Elizabeth replied, setting the card down with careful precision. Refusing would only confirm what they already suspect, that I'm ashamed to show my face. I gave up shame a long time ago, Vincent. I can't afford to buy it back now. Still, that night, alone in her chambers, she stood before the mirror longer than necessary, studying the woman staring back at her, a Duchess now, in name and title, and yet still, underneath it all, the same Governess who had been publicly cast out of polite society without a single person asking whether the scandal that ruined her had even been true. She knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who understood how cruelty worked, that Lady Ashworth's gala would not simply be an evening of dancing and idle conversation. It would be a battlefield, and she intended to walk into it with her spine straight and her guard raised. The estate had grown busier in preparation, new gowns commissioned, carriages readied, Bramwell's continued nervous evasions momentarily set aside for the more pressing matter of Elizabeth's reintroduction to the world that had once discarded her. They'll be watching for any misstep, Mrs. Pemberton warned, though whether from genuine concern or simple anticipation of Elizabeth's downfall, it was impossible to tell. Society doesn't forgive easily, Your Grace. Society doesn't need to forgive me, Elizabeth said evenly, for something I never did. The housekeeper's eyebrows lifted slightly at that, and Elizabeth realised, too late, that she'd revealed more than she'd intended, a crack in the careful mystery she'd maintained around her past dismissal since arriving at Westfield. She said nothing further, and neither did Mrs. Pemberton. Though the exchange lingered in the air between them like an unfinished conversation both women knew would eventually need finishing. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear, stars glittering hard and bright above Lady Ashworth's sprawling townhouse, its windows blazing with candlelight and the murmur of London's finest gathered inside. Elizabeth stepped from the carriage in deep sapphire silk, her hair arranged in careful curls, and pinned at her collar knot the heirloom brooch, not yet, that remained locked away for reasons she hadn't fully examined, but a simple silver pin that still managed to look like armor against the judgment waiting inside.
Ready? Vincent asked, offering his arm.
No, Elizabeth admitted. But that's never stopped me before. They entered together, and the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees despite the roaring fireplace and dozens of candles' conversations pausing mid-sentence, heads turning, a ripple of recognition and whispered scandal spreading through the crowd, faster than Elizabeth could take 3 steps into the ballroom. "There she is," someone murmured, not quite quietly enough. "The Governess." "I heard the Duke married her out of pity," another voice added. "Poor man, saddled with damaged goods." Elizabeth's spine straightened further, her chin lifting into that fierce, familiar angle, and beside her, she felt Vincent's arm tense beneath her hand knot in embarrassment, she realized, but in barely restrained fury on her behalf. "Ignore them," he murmured. "I intend to," Elizabeth replied, though the effort of maintaining her composure cost her more than she cared to admit. Lady Ashworth herself approached within minutes, resplendent in emerald silk, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Duchess Westfield. How brave of you to attend." "Why wouldn't I attend my own society's gala, Lady Ashworth?" Elizabeth replied smoothly. "I'm told the refreshments here are excellent." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the small crowd gathered nearby, and Lady Ashworth's smile tightened at the edges, clearly having expected a more flustered, easily wounded response. "Of course," she said. "Though I do wonder if the Duke has told you everything about your own scandal, my dear, or only what he needed to do to convince you a marriage of convenience was your only remaining option." The words landed like a slap, deliberate and precise, and Elizabeth felt the ground shift slightly beneath her feet, not from the accusation itself, but from the sudden, terrifying possibility that Lady Ashworth knew something Elizabeth herself didn't. Vincent's hand tightened over Elizabeth's on his arm, a silent warning, though whether meant for her or for himself, Elizabeth couldn't tell. "I think," Vincent said, his voice dropping into something dangerously calm, "you should choose your next words with considerably more care, Lady Ashworth." But Lady Ashworth only smiled wider, clearly enjoying herself, and turned to address the small crowd that had gathered around them with the practiced cruelty of a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of public humiliation. Perhaps the Duchess would like to share with everyone exactly why she was dismissed from her previous position. Lady Ashworth continued, her voice carrying easily across the increasingly silent ballroom. "I understand the details are quite scandalous." Elizabeth felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the weight of years-old shame pressing down on her chest like a physical thing, and for one terrible moment, standing in that glittering ballroom surrounded by silk and candlelight and cruelty dressed as curiosity, she understood that everything she had built at Westfield of Ledger reconciled, every corrupt steward exposed, every ounce of hard-won respect was about to be undone by a single, carefully aimed accusation she had no way of disproving in front of an audience already primed to believe the worst. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, and Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, though with what words? She genuinely didn't know when Vincent stepped forward, releasing her arm, and turned to face the assembled crowd with an expression that made even Lady Ashworth take an involuntary step backward. Since Lady Ashworth seemed so eager to discuss scandal, Vincent said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom, low and controlled and utterly without mercy. Perhaps we should discuss the truth of what happened to my wife, rather than the fiction that's been so conveniently spread by those who benefited from her ruin. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Lady Ashworth's confident smile faltered for the first time. The scandal that ended my wife's position as governess, Vincent continued, was manufactured entirely by the very family who employed her family, desperate to hide their own son's misconduct by placing the blame on an innocent woman with no power to defend herself. I have documentation. I have witnesses willing to testify. And I have very little patience remaining for anyone in this room who continues to repeat lies they have never bothered to verify. The ballroom fell utterly silent, every guest suddenly finding their glass of champagne or the pattern of the ballroom floor far more interesting than meeting the Duke's icy gaze. "Your Grace," Lady Ashworth began, her composure cracking, "I only meant—" "I know precisely what you meant," Vincent said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "And I would advise you, and anyone else in this room inclined towards similar cruelty, to remember that the Duke of Westfield does not forget insults to his family. Nor does he forgive them easily." He turned, offering his arm back to Elizabeth, who took it with trembling fingers. She hoped no one else could see. "Shall we?" he asked quietly, and together they walked from the ballroom, leaving behind a room full of London's finest, suddenly reconsidering every cruel word they'd whispered about the Duchess of Westfield. The carriage ride home was silent, tense, filled with words neither of them seemed able to speak. "You didn't have to do that," Elizabeth finally said, staring out at the passing darkness. "I did," Vincent replied simply. "I couldn't stand there and watch them tear you apart for something you never did." "How did you know?" Elizabeth turned to face him, something raw and vulnerable breaking through her careful composure for the first time since he'd found her in that pawn shop. "About the scandal. About what really happened." Vincent's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elizabeth thought he might actually answer honestly. "I made it my business to know," he said instead, turning to look out his own window, his voice retreating back into careful, professional distance. "That's all that matters." Elizabeth studied his profile in the dim carriage light, sensing walls rising back into place between them just as quickly as they'd fallen during his defense of her in that ballroom, and she wondered, with a growing ache she didn't fully understand, why a man capable of such fierce, public loyalty could retreat so completely into icy politeness the moment they were alone. The following week settled into an uneasy new rhythm. Word of Vincent's ballroom defence spread through London society with predictable speed, and Elizabeth found herself treated with a wary, uncertain respect by people who had, only weeks before, been eager to see her humiliated respect born not from genuine acceptance, but from fear of the Duke's wrath. At Westfield, however, things had grown colder rather than warmer. Vincent remained scrupulously polite, unfailingly correct in every interaction, and utterly, maddeningly distant as, though the passionate defence he'd offered in Lady Ashworth's ballroom had cost him something he was determined never to spend again. "Good morning, Your Grace," he would say over breakfast, his voice perfectly courteous and empty of warmth. "Good morning," Elizabeth would reply, matching his careful distance with equally careful distance of her own, though something in her chest ached every time he retreated behind that polite professional mask. She told herself it didn't matter. Their marriage was a contract, nothing more, and she had no right to expect warmth from a man who had never promised her any. And yet she found herself replaying his words from that ballroom late at night. Alone in her chamber's eye, couldn't stand there and watch them tear you apart and wondering what exactly a man who felt nothing beyond practical obligation had meant by words like that. She didn't have time to examine the question further, because within days, A new crisis had begun consuming her attention, entirely one considerably more dangerous than wounded pride or unanswered questions about her husband's true feelings. The first sign came from the granary steward, a nervous young man named Collins, who arrived at Elizabeth's study white-faced and stammering. "Your Grace, I think there's been some interference with the winter grain stores." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. Interference? Explain. "Someone's been altering the ledgers," Collins said, "showing full reserves when the actual stores are significantly depleted. I only discovered it by chance, checking the physical inventory against the recorded amounts." Elizabeth was on her feet immediately, following Collins to the granary with her heart pounding, and what she found there confirmed her worst fears: sacks of grain that should have contained enough to sustain the entire estate's household and tenant farms through the harsh winter months, nearly half of them empty or filled with worthless chaff and filler. "This is sabotage," Elizabeth breathed, staring at the near-empty stores. "Deliberate, calculated sabotage." "Bramwell," Vincent said grimly, arriving moments later at the urgent summons Elizabeth had sent. "He knows you're close to proving his theft. This is his retaliation." "Or his desperation," Elizabeth corrected, her mind already racing through calculations, contingencies, the terrifying arithmetic of how many mouths needed feeding through a winter that had just become considerably more dangerous. If the estate can't feed its tenant families through the winter, dozens of people could starve, Vincent. This isn't just about money anymore. The weight of that truth settled over both of them, cold and absolute, and Elizabeth felt the familiar surge of fierce, protective determination rise up to meet the crisis, the same determination that had once made her fight for her students' education, that had made her fight her way back from destitution, that now demanded she fight for an entire household's survival. "I need every available carton worker," she said, already moving toward the door. "We need to inventory exactly what remains, calculate exactly what we need to purchase to cover the shortfall, and find suppliers willing to sell grain this late in the season before prices climb even further out of reach."
"Elizabeth, it's nearly nightfall."
"Then we work through the night," she said, turning back to face him, her eyes blazing with fierce resolve. "I will not let this estate's people starve because of one greedy man's petty revenge, Vincent. Not while I have breath left to prevent it." Something shifted in Vincent's expression: admiration, unguarded and raw, breaking briefly through his careful composure before he caught himself and smoothed it away. "Then we work through the night," he agreed quietly, and for the first time in weeks, something like genuine partnership passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable. The hours that followed blurred into desperate, exhausting motion. Elizabeth worked by lamplight in the granary, recalculating inventories with Collins and a team of hastily assembled workers, while Vincent rode out personally to neighbouring estates and grain merchants, using every ounce of his authority and reputation to secure emergency purchases before word of Westfield's shortage could spread and drive prices even higher. By midnight, Elizabeth's hands were raw from handling rough burlap sacks, her fine gown long since abandoned for a simple work dress, her elegant hair falling loose from its pins as she moved between stores, ledgers, and increasingly worried tenant farmers who had begun arriving at the estate seeking reassurance. "We'll have enough," she told each of them, projecting a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I promise you, no family under Westfield's protection will go hungry this winter." It was well past 2 a.m. when Vincent finally returned, exhausted and mud-splattered from hours of hard riding, carrying news of 3 separate suppliers who had agreed to emergency shipments enough, combined with what remained of the estate's actual reserves, to see them through the winter with careful rationing. He found Elizabeth still in the granary, sitting exhausted against a stack of grain sacks, her eyes closed, her whole body slumped with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent every last reserve of strength fighting for people who weren't even hers by blood.
Elizabeth.
Her eyes opened slowly, meeting him in the dim lamplight. Did you find enough?
Enough, he confirmed. We'll survive the winter.
Relief broke across her face, raw and unguarded, and before either of them fully understood what was happening, Vincent had crossed the small space between them and pulled her into his arms, not the careful professional distance he'd maintained for weeks, but something fierce and desperate and real. Elizabeth stiffened for a moment in surprise then, exhausted beyond the strength required for pride, let herself lean into his embrace, her face pressed against his mud-stained coat, breathing in the scent of horse and cold night air and something uniquely him. You didn't have to ride out by yourself, she murmured against his chest. You could have sent someone. I couldn't, Vincent said quietly, his hand moving unconsciously to smooth her loose hair. I couldn't sit at home while you fought this alone. The moment stretched, warm and fragile, until Vincent seemed to catch himself, stepping back with sudden, deliberate distance, clearing his throat. You should rest, he said, his voice retreating back into that careful professional register she'd come to dread. Tomorrow will bring its own difficulties. He left the granary without waiting for her response, and Elizabeth sat alone in the lamplight, staring after him, her heart pounding with confusion and something achingly close to hope that she didn't dare name. Bramwell, confronted the following morning with undeniable evidence linking him to the sabotaged grain stores, confessed everything with the desperate speed of a man who knew the game was finally, irrevocably over the years of embezzlement, the fictitious vendors, and finally, the deliberate sabotage meant to bankrupt the estate before Elizabeth could complete her investigation. He was dismissed within the hour, escorted from the estate grounds by 2 footmen, while the remaining household staff watched in tense silence, understanding that an era of comfortable corruption had finally, completely ended. You did it, Vincent said, finding Elizabeth in the study afterward, staring at the now empty desk where Bramwell had once presided over years of theft. You saved this estate, Elizabeth. Its finances, its people, its future. We saved it, Elizabeth corrected quietly. Together. Vincent said nothing, though something flickered across his face, longing perhaps, or regret before he retreated once again behind careful, professional courtesy. I should see to the remaining accounts, he said. There's still much to reorganize. He left, and Elizabeth remained standing alone in the study, staring after him with growing, exhausted frustration. Weeks of this careful dance had worn her down to something raw and honest, and she found herself increasingly unable to understand the man she'd married, fierce and protective in moments of crisis, distant and guarded the moment that crisis passed, as though he were terrified of what might happen if he allowed himself to remain close for too long. She didn't know, not yet, that Vincent's careful distance wasn't coldness at all, but its precise opposite, a desperate, exhausting effort to protect her pride by never allowing her to feel like a woman, rescued, rather than a duchess who had earned her place through her own formidable strength. But exhaustion, Elizabeth was learning, had a way of eroding even the most carefully maintained patience, and something in her was beginning to fray past the point of quiet endurance. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived on an evening much like any other, except that Elizabeth had reached the absolute limit of what her pride could silently withstand. She found Vincent in the grand library, standing before the tall windows overlooking the estate's moonlit grounds, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand, his expression distant and unreadable in the low firelight. We need to talk, Elizabeth said, closing the library door firmly behind her. Vincent turned, something guarded immediately settling into his features. Is something wrong with the accounts? The accounts are fine, Elizabeth said, crossing the room with quick, determined steps. This isn't about the accounts, Vincent. This is about us. There is no us, he said carefully, though something in his voice wavered slightly. There's a contract, an arrangement. We agreed. We agreed to a marriage of convenience, Elizabeth interrupted, not to whatever this is. Not to months of you being fiercely protective one moment and coldly distant the next. Not to you holding me in that granary like I mattered to you, only to retreat the very next morning behind polite nothings and professional courtesy. Vincent's jaw tightened, his grip on the brandy glass whitening. Elizabeth, I feel like a paid employee in my own marriage, Elizabeth continued, months of exhaustion and confusion finally breaking free in a rush she couldn't stop. I manage your estate. I fight your battles. I saved your household from starvation, Vincent, and still, every single night, you retreat to your chambers, and I retreat to mine, and we exchange nothing but careful, empty courtesy across a table, as though warmth between us would somehow break the terms of a contract neither of us actually wants to honor anymore. You don't understand, Vincent said, his voice strained. Then make me understand. Elizabeth's composure finally cracked entirely, months of careful control giving way to raw, exhausted honesty. Why would a powerful duke shackle himself to a ruined governess, Vincent? Why go to such lengths buying back my brooch, tracing me through a pawnbroker's private records, defending me in front of all of London society if all you truly feel is a practical obligation? Explain it to me, because I have spent months trying to understand a man who runs hot and cold with no warning, and I am tired, Vincent. I am so tired of guessing. Silence fell, thick and absolute, broken only by the crackling fire and Elizabeth's ragged, uneven breathing. Vincent set down his brandy glass with deliberate care, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of careful distance, cracking open with something raw and long buried. Because I never stopped loving you, he said. Not for one single day since you left my family's employ 3 years ago. Elizabeth stared at him, the words landing like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs.
What?
I loved you then. Vincent continued, the words coming faster now, months of careful restraint finally breaking apart entirely, when you were nothing more than my younger cousin's governess, when society would have called it entirely inappropriate for a duke's heir to feel anything beyond polite indifference toward a woman in service. I loved you when you were dismissed on false charges I couldn't prove and wasn't in London to prevent. And I loved you, God help me, standing in that pawn shop watching you sell the last piece of your family's dignity, hating myself for every single day I'd spent too cowardly to simply tell you the truth. The marriage, Elizabeth whispered, understanding beginning to dawn, terrible and beautiful all at once. The contract. It was never merely practical, Vincent confirmed, closing the distance between them, his hands trembling as they reached for hers. I engineered every part of it, Elizabeth. I knew your pride would never accept direct charity, never accept a proposal built on pity or rescue. So I built you a contract instead, a professional arrangement your fierce independence could accept, when what I truly wanted, what I have wanted since the day you left, was simply you. Not a duchess. Not an administrator. You. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. She no longer had the strength to blink away. And the distance? The coldness? Was never cold, Vincent said, his voice breaking. It was fear. Fear that if I let myself get too close, too warm, you'd see the truth of how desperately I loved you and feel trapped by it, feel like you owed me something beyond the contract we'd agreed to. I was terrified of making you feel obligated to love a man who had essentially purchased your survival. You fool! Elizabeth breathed, though the words carried no anger, only aching, disbelieving tenderness. You absolute wonderful fool. Do you understand what these months of distance cost me? I thought you felt nothing. I thought I was simply convenient, capable hands to manage your estate, nothing more. You were never simply convenient, Vincent said fiercely. You were never anything less than everything, Elizabeth. I have loved you across 3 years, across an ocean, across a pawnshop counter, and a freezing garret, and 100 careful, cowardly silences I regret with every fibre of my being. I love you now, standing here, more completely than I have ever loved anything in my entire life. Elizabeth stood frozen for a long moment, feeling months of confusion, exhaustion, and carefully guarded hope finally collapse into overwhelming, breathtaking clarity. Then, without another word, she turned and left the library. Vincent's heart plummeted, certain he had finally ruined everything with a confession offered far too late until Elizabeth returned, only minutes later, carrying a small velvet box he recognized instantly. The heirloom brooch. The one he'd bought back from Hemlock's pawn shop that first desperate day. The one he'd kept locked away, waiting for a moment he hadn't been certain would ever arrive. You kept it, Elizabeth said softly, opening the box to reveal the delicate piece of jewelry glinting in the firelight. I kept everything that mattered, Vincent said quietly. Especially the things I was too afraid to give back properly. Elizabeth lifted the brooch from its velvet cushion, her hands steady now in a way they hadn't been in that London pawn shop months before, and pinned it carefully to her lapel knot as a symbol of desperate survival this time, but as something entirely different. When I sold this, she said, I sold the last piece of who I used to be. I told myself I'd lost everything, my position, my reputation, my family's legacy, all of it gone in a single desperate transaction. But you bought it back, Vincent. You gave me back not just this brooch, but my entire life, wrapped in a lie so carefully constructed I never once suspected the truth beneath it. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. I don't want to manage your estate anymore, she said. Not as a duty. Not as a contract. Vincent's breath caught, uncertain hope and fear warring across his features. Elizabeth, I want to manage your heart instead, she finished, closing the last distance between them entirely. If you'll let me. Truly. Completely. No more contracts. No more careful distance. Just. Vincent's answer came not in words, but in the way he finally completely closed the space between them. His hands framing her face with a tenderness that spoke of 3 years of restrained longing finally allowed release, and when he kissed her, it was nothing like the careful. Professional distance they'd maintained for months was fierce and certain and overflowing with everything he'd been too afraid to say until exhaustion and honesty had finally broken them both open. When they finally parted, breathless, Elizabeth rested her forehead against his, laughing softly through unexpected tears. We are going to have to explain this to an awful lot of people who think our marriage is purely business, she murmured. Let them wonder, Vincent replied, his voice warm now, unguarded, entirely hers. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure the truth becomes impossible to doubt. Outside the library windows, snow had begun falling softly over Westfield's sprawling grounds, blanketing the estate that had nearly fallen to corruption and sabotage in pristine, quiet whiter fitting, peaceful contrast to the storm of honesty that had just cleared between two people who had spent far too long mistaking careful distance for safety, when all along, the only real safety had been in finally telling the truth. Elizabeth Sterling had arrived at Westfield believing herself rescued from poverty by a stranger's practical convenience. She left that library understanding she had been loved quietly, fiercely, and completely since long before either of them had ever dared to say so aloud. And perhaps that's the lesson worth carrying forward long after this story ends. that the people who truly love us don't always announce it loudly. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do isn't wait patiently for someone else's courage, but demand, as Elizabeth finally did, the honesty we deserve.
If you've ever mistaken someone's careful distance for indifference, or built your own walls so high that love had to fight its way through disguise just to reach you, tell me about it below.
Because somewhere out there, someone is still waiting in their own version of that library, wondering if the truth is worth the risk, and maybe your story is exactly what they need to hear before they finally ask their own question out loud. Stay close, because Westfield's story may have found its ending tonight. But there are so many more waiting in the shadows for their own truth to finally break free, and I'd love nothing more than for you to be here when they do.